Clara felt the weight of the silence more than the noise. The dining room, a cavern of mahogany and crystal, buzzed with the self-important chatter of Richard's world. Men in tailored suits laughed too loudly, their voices slick with expensive whiskey. Women with diamonds glittering at their throats offered brittle smiles, their eyes constantly scanning the room, assessing, comparing, judging. It was a room built on the foundations of envy and ambition, and Clara, in her simple navy dress, felt like a ghost at the feast. Her husband, Richard, stood at the head of the table, a king in his own court. He held a glass of wine, swirling the deep crimson liquid as he spoke. His voice was a confident baritone, the kind that expected to be obeyed, the kind that never entertained the possibility of being wrong. He was telling a story about a recent acquisition, a hostile takeover that had apparently been a stroke of pure genius. His genius. "I never saw it coming," Richard boasted, a smug grin playing on his lips. The board was full of old money, complacent dinosaurs. They thought their legacy would protect them. But in this world, legacy is a liability. You have to be hungry. You have to be ruthless. He looked down the table, his gaze sweeping over his guests before it landed, with a subtle but deliberate drop in temperature, on Clara, and next to her, on her Uncle Arthur. Clara's heart did a familiar, painful little flip. She had begged Richard not to insist on Arthur coming tonight. It wasn't his world. Arthur was a man of quiet routines and simpler pleasures. He had spent 40 years as a municipal archivist, a keeper of forgotten records and dusty histories. He lived in a small, tidy bungalow filled with books and the scent of lemon polish. He was gentle, kind, and utterly unimpressed by the gilded cage Richard called a life. "Of course, not everyone understands that killer instinct," Richard continued, his eyes still fixed on them. The air in the room shifted, the chatter quieted. The guests, like predators sensing a weakness in the herd, turned their attention to the new target. Some people are content to live small lives, quiet lives, cataloguing old papers, I suppose. A few of Richard's sycophants chuckled. It was a cruel, dismissive sound. Clara felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She looked at her uncle. Arthur sat perfectly still, his hands resting on his lap. He was looking at his plate, a small, polite smile on his face, as if he were listening to a mildly interesting lecture that had very little to do with him. His calm was a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside Clara. For 10 years she had endured this. Richard's casual cruelty, his public humiliations disguised as jokes. He saw her family as a stain on his otherwise perfect tapestry of success. They were a reminder of the modest beginnings he had worked so hard to escape, and by extension, a reminder that Clara herself was not of his world. He had married her, he once drunkenly confessed to a friend, because her quiet compliance was a perfect backdrop for his brilliance. "Take Clara's uncle here," Richard said, gesturing with his wineglass. The gesture was like a flick of a whip. "A good man, a simple man, wouldn't know a stock option from a bus ticket. And there's nothing wrong with that. The world needs its worker bees, doesn't it?" The humiliation was absolute. It hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Clara wanted the floor to swallow her whole. She could feel the pitying glances from the other women, glances that were far more painful than outright scorn. They saw her as Richard saw her, a decorative object with a regrettable backstory. She risked another look at Arthur. He had finally lifted his head. His eyes, a pale and unassuming blue, met hers. There was no anger in them, no hurt. There was just a quiet, steady resolve that seemed to cut through the oppressive atmosphere like a beacon. He gave her the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture that said, "I am fine. Endure this. It will pass." But for Clara, something inside had finally snapped. A decade of swallowed insults, of forced smiles, of pretending she didn't hear the condescension in his voice had coalesced into a single, hard point of incandescent rage. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about this good, kind man being used as a prop in Richard's cruel theatre. Richard, oblivious to the seismic shift occurring within his wife, delivered his final, devastating blow. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He extracted a crisp $100 bill and flamboyantly placed it on the table next to Arthur's bread plate. "Here you go, Arthur," Richard said, his voice dripping with false magnanimity. "A little something to help with the gas bill. I know things can be tight on a fixed income." A collective gasp, quickly suppressed, rippled through the guests. This was no longer a joke. It was a public execution of dignity. The money lay there on the fine linen, a stark, vulgar insult. Arthur looked at the bill, then back at Richard. He still didn't speak. He simply picked up his water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. The silence that followed was broken by Richard's booming laugh. "Don't be proud. We're family after all." Clara stood up. The scraping of her chair legs on the polished floor was unnaturally loud. Every eye in the room swiveled to her. Richard's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, annoyed by the interruption to his performance. "I have a terrible headache," Clara said, her voice a strained whisper. "Please, excuse me." She turned and walked out of the dining room, her back straight, her head held high. She didn't run, she didn't cry. She walked with the cold, measured pace of someone who had just made a decision from which there was no turning back. As she passed through the grand foyer, she caught a glimpse of herself in the enormous gilt-edged mirror. She saw a pale, trembling woman in a simple dress, but for the first time in a very long time, she also saw a flicker of something else in her eyes, something hard and unyielding, something that looked a lot like a killer instinct. The worker bee was done being quiet. The hive was about to be broken. Later that night, long after the last guest had departed, Richard found her in the library, staring out the window at the city lights. He was still buzzing from his social triumph, oblivious to the chasm that had opened between them. "Quite a night, wasn't it?" he said, loosening his tie. "I think I really sealed the deal with Henderson. He was practically eating out of my hand." Clara didn't turn around. "You were cruel to my uncle, Richard." He scoffed, the sound dismissive. "Oh, please, don't be so dramatic. It was a joke. Arthur gets it. People like that, they don't have the same sense of pride. It's not like he's one of us." One of us. The phrase echoed in the silent room. It was the bedrock of Richard's philosophy. The world was divided into two groups, people like him, the winners, the elite, and everyone else, the insignificant masses who existed only to serve or be pitied. For 10 years, Clara had tried to belong, to be one of them. She had changed her clothes, her friends, the way she spoke. She had sanded down every edge of her former self to fit into the smooth, polished box he had built for her. "What does that even mean?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "It means people who matter," he said simply, as if explaining a basic fact of life to a child. People who build things, who take risks, who shape the world, not people who shuffle papers in a dusty basement for 40 years and call it a life. He walked over to the bar and poured himself a brandy. "Your uncle is a nobody, Clara. A sweet, harmless, irrelevant nobody. The sooner you accept that, the easier things will be." He took a sip of his drink, the picture of self-satisfaction. He was so confident in his worldview, so utterly certain of his own superiority, that he couldn't see the abyss he had just opened at his own feet. He couldn't see that the woman standing by the window was no longer the compliant girl he had married. She was a stranger forged in the fire of his own casual cruelty. Clara finally turned to face him. The trembling was gone. Her eyes were clear and cold. "You're right," she said. "He isn't one of you. Thank God for that." Before he could process the strange, defiant tone in her voice, she walked past him and out of the room. As she climbed the sweeping staircase to their bedroom, she felt a profound sense of lightness. The weight she had been carrying for a decade, the weight of his expectations, his judgment, his contempt, had vanished. In its place was a singular, clarifying purpose. Richard believed he was a builder, a shaper of the world. She was about to teach him that anyone, even a nobody, could be a demolitions expert. All it took was finding the right pressure point. And tonight, he hadn't just shown her the pressure point. He had handed her the detonator. The next morning, Clara found the card. It was in the pocket of the coat Arthur had left in the hall closet. She had retrieved it for him before he left, a silent apology in her eyes as he departed in a simple taxi, refusing Richard's condescending offer of a private driver. He had squeezed her hand, a brief, reassuring pressure, and she knew he had felt the card press against her palm. It was a simple piece of cardstock, impossibly plain. No logo, no address, just a name, A. Sterling, and a phone number. Sterling was Arthur's middle name, one he never used. It felt like a code, a secret identity. Clara stared at the 10 digits, her heart pounding. This was the first step into a new, unknown territory. For years her life had been a well-worn path, dictated entirely by Richard's whims. Making this call felt like stepping off a cliff. She waited until Richard had left for the day, his departure announced by the roar of his sports car's engine, a daily assertion of his importance. The house fell into a deep, oppressive silence. Clara walked to the kitchen, the card clutched in her hand. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the number. It rang only once before a calm, professional voice answered. "Sterling's office." "Hello?" Clara began, her own voice sounding foreign and hesitant. I was given this number by Arthur. Arthur Pendleton." "One moment, please," the voice said. There was a soft click, and then a new voice came on the line. It was warm, yet carried an unmistakable authority. "Clara, I was hoping you would call." It was Arthur, but it wasn't the voice of the gentle, shuffling archivist she knew. This voice had an edge of steel, a resonance of command she had never heard before. "Uncle Arthur?" she asked, confused. "Where are you? What is this?" "It's time we had a talk, my dear," he said. "A proper one. Away from prying eyes and ears. Can you meet me? I'll send a car for you in 1 hour." He gave her an address in the heart of the financial district, a part of the city Richard claimed as his personal kingdom. Clara agreed, her mind reeling, and an hour later, a discreet black sedan, the kind that whispered of serious money, pulled up to the curb. The driver, a man in a crisp suit, opened the door for her without a word. As the car pulled away from the opulent prison she called home, Clara felt a thrilling, terrifying sense of freedom. She was driving into a fog with no idea what lay on the other side, but for the first time in a decade, she was the one at the wheel of her own life. The history of their marriage was a study in gradual erasure. When they first met, Richard had been captivated by her. She was a bright, aspiring art historian, full of passion for Renaissance painters and obscure sculptors. He was an up-and-coming real estate developer, hungry and ambitious. He had pursued her with a relentless energy, showering her with gifts and promises of a world she could barely imagine. He had called her his moral compass, his anchor of authenticity. He claimed to love her for her simplicity, for her lack of interest in the cutthroat world he inhabited. But over time, that professed admiration had curdled into a tool of control. Her opinions on art were quaint. Her friends were provincial. Her desire to work at a museum was a sweet little hobby that was ultimately unnecessary now that she had him. Slowly, methodically, he had isolated her. He convinced her that his business contacts were more important than her old college friends. He persuaded her that managing their grand home and hosting his lavish parties was a full-time job, a partnership in his success. Every choice she made was subtly steered by his approval, until her life was a reflection not of her own desires, but of his needs. Her family was the last bastion of her old self, and he had worked tirelessly to demolish it. He treated her parents with a cloying condescension, always making jokes about their modest home or their simple vacations. He saw them as a weakness, a flaw in his perfect brand. And Uncle Arthur, with his quiet dignity and complete lack of pretense, was the embodiment of everything Richard despised. He couldn't be bought, he couldn't be impressed, and therefore, in Richard's eyes, he was worthless. Now, as the sedan glided through the steel and glass canyons of the financial district, Clara saw the last 10 years with a brutal, unforgiving clarity. She hadn't been a partner, she had been an acquisition, a piece of art he had purchased to hang on his wall, one that he now felt was clashing with the decor. Meanwhile, Richard was in his element. He strode into the boardroom of his company, Rylan Enterprises, feeling invincible. The dinner party had been a resounding success. He had charmed Henderson, intimidated a rival, and put his wife's pathetic family in their place. All was right with the world. "Morning, everyone," he boomed, flashing a predatory smile at his executive team. "Big news. I just got off the phone with the consortium. They're ready to move on the waterfront project. We just need to secure the final round of financing, another $500 million. His CFO, a nervous man named Peterson, paled slightly. "Richard, the banks are already getting skittish about our debt-to-equity ratio. Our existing credit lines are stretched to the limit." Richard waved a dismissive hand. "Nonsense, Peterson. You worry too much. These faceless funds, they're just numbers on a spreadsheet. They don't care about ratios, they care about returns. And the Rylan name delivers returns. Call them. Tell them I need the money wired by Friday. They'll jump. They always do." He was utterly confident. His entire empire was built on a mountain of debt, a complex web of loans and credit lines from a dozen different investment vehicles and subsidiary banks. He saw them as an infinite resource, a faceless entity that existed solely to fuel his ambition. He never bothered to look too closely at the fine print, or to wonder who was truly behind the anonymous corporate names. He believed his own hype, that his genius was the only collateral they needed. It was an arrogance of cosmic proportions, and it was about to become his undoing. The black sedan pulled into a private underground garage beneath a sleek, anonymous skyscraper. The driver led Clara to a private elevator, which ascended without a sound. The doors opened directly into a reception area that was the epitome of understated power. There were no logos on the wall, just museum-quality art and quiet, expensive furniture. A woman with a serene smile greeted her. "Mrs. Vance, Mr. Sterling is expecting you." She was led down a long, quiet hallway and into a corner office with a breathtaking view of the city. And there, sitting behind a large, clean desk, was her Uncle Arthur. He wore a simple grey suit, but he wore it with an authority she had never seen before. The gentle, slightly stooped archivist was gone. In his place was a man who looked like he owned the view. "Clara," he said, standing up and smiling. It was his old, kind smile, but it sat differently on this new man. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit." Next to him stood another man, sharp and alert, who Arthur introduced as his lead counsel, Mr. Davies.
"Uncle Arthur, I don't understand," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. "What is this place?" Arthur sat down and folded his hands on the desk. "This, my dear, is the office of the Aurelian Global Fund, and A. Sterling is the name I use when I manage it." Clara stared at him, dumbfounded. "Fund? What fund?" Mr. Davies stepped forward, holding a slim tablet. "Aurelian Global is a private equity and asset management fund, Mrs. Vance. It currently has assets under management in excess of $40 billion. The number hung in the air, so vast it was meaningless. 40 billion.
It was a figure from a newspaper headline, not from her uncle's quiet life. "But, you were an archivist. You live in that little house." "I was an archivist," Arthur corrected gently. "I enjoyed the work. It was quiet, methodical. It suited me. The house is where I live. This," he gestured around the vast office, "is what I do. I've always preferred to keep the two separate. Anonymity is a valuable asset, perhaps the most valuable of all." He explained it all with a calm, patient logic. Decades ago, his father, Clara's grandfather, had made a series of incredibly shrewd investments in early technology. He had entrusted the small but growing fortune to his son, Arthur, who had a quiet, methodical genius for numbers and systems. Over 40 years, through careful, silent, and brilliant management, Arthur had grown that seed money into a global financial empire. He operated through layers of trusts, holding companies, and anonymous subsidiaries. He was the ultimate faceless banker. Clara's mind was spinning, trying to reconcile the image of the man who brought her lemonade and helped with her history homework with the silent titan of finance sitting before her. Then Mr. Davies swiped to a new page on his tablet and placed it on the desk in front of her. It was a corporate flowchart. At the top was a box that read Rylan Enterprises. Branching down from it were lines connecting to a dozen smaller boxes with names like Apex Lending, Viridian Capital, and Blue Ridge Financial. "Richard's company," Clara breathed. "Indeed," said Davies. "And these are the primary lenders and credit facilities that finance his operations. He believes them to be separate, competing entities. He leverages them against each other constantly." He tapped the screen. Lines appeared, connecting all the smaller boxes to a single, larger entity at the very bottom of the chart. The name in that final box made the air leave Clara's lungs. Aurelian Global Fund. "Every loan," Arthur said, his voice soft but heavy with meaning. "Every line of credit, every mortgage on every building he has ever purchased, it all flows from us. We hold the paper on his entire empire, Clara. He built his kingdom on my money." The irony was so staggering, so profoundly, cruelly perfect, that Clara felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in her chest. She choked it back. Richard, the great man, the titan of industry, who looked down on her simple, poor family, was nothing more than a tenant in a house owned by the very man he had so publicly humiliated. His arrogance, his condescension, his entire sense of self-worth, it was all financed by the irrelevant nobody he had scorned. "He's applying for a new loan," Clara said, the pieces clicking into place with sickening speed. "For the waterfront project." 500 million, Arthur confirmed with a nod. "The request is sitting on my desk. He is, to put it mildly, over-leveraged. He has broken dozens of covenants in his existing loan agreements, things a more diligent lender would have flagged years ago, but I have always indulged him for your sake." The unspoken words hung between them. "And this is how he repays you." Arthur leaned forward, his expression becoming serious. "I have let this go on for too long, Clara. I stood by while he belittled you and your family. I stayed quiet because I thought it was what you wanted, because I did not want to interfere in your marriage. But what he did the other night, that was a line. He didn't just insult me, he insulted you by assuming you were as blind and foolish as he is." He paused, his pale blue eyes locking onto hers. "So now the decision is yours. I can approve the new loan. We can continue this charade, and he will never be the wiser. Or we can choose a different path. The power to do so is entirely in our hands. More specifically, it is in yours." Mr. Davies placed a single sheet of paper and a pen on the desk. It was a legal document, a simple proxy authorization. It would give Arthur's legal team the authority to act on behalf of the fund's interests regarding all accounts related to Rylan Enterprises. Clara looked at the paper, then at her uncle's steady, waiting face. There was no pressure, no expectation, just a choice. A clear, stark choice between the life of quiet suffering she had known and a future she could not yet imagine. She thought of Richard's smug face at the dinner table. She thought of the $100 bill lying like a slug on the white linen tablecloth. She thought of 10 years of being made to feel small, stupid, and insignificant. Her hand did not tremble as she picked up the pen. The signature was a firm, clear stroke. The decision was made. There would be no more charades. The strategy session that followed was a masterclass in surgical destruction. It wasn't in the grand boardroom, but in a smaller, more private conference room. A large digital whiteboard dominated one wall, displaying the intricate web of Richard's financial life. Clara sat at the table with Arthur and a team of 4 of his sharpest legal and financial minds. "The goal here is not simply to bankrupt him," Davies explained, pointing a laser at the board. "That would be crude. The goal is to create a cascade failure. We will use his own arrogance and his contractual breaches against him. He will be the architect of his own ruin." The plan was elegant in its cruelty. They wouldn't start with the biggest loans. They would start small with a subsidiary called Pinnacle Bridge Financing. Pinnacle held a relatively minor $7 million bridge loan for one of Richard's smaller commercial properties. Crucially, that loan had a clause, one Richard had surely never read, allowing it to be called due with 24 hours' notice if the borrower's overall debt-to-liquid asset ratio exceeded a certain threshold. "His ratio exceeded that threshold 6 months ago," a young analyst noted, tapping on a laptop. "He's been in breach all this time." "Excellent," Davies said with a thin smile. "So step 1, Pinnacle calls the $7 million loan due in full by tomorrow, citing the breach. He won't have the liquid cash to cover it. He'll have to scramble." "But $7 million is nothing to him," Clara interjected. "He'll just move money around." "Ah," Davies said, "but that's where step 2 comes in." He drew a line on the board from the Pinnacle box to the largest lender, Viridian Capital, which held over $1 billion of Richard's debt. The Viridian loan agreement contains a cross-default provision. A default on any loan from any lender constitutes an immediate default on the Viridian loan itself. Clara saw it then. It was like watching a master chess player describe a checkmate 10 moves in advance. The tiny, insignificant loan from Pinnacle was the pawn that would topple the king. "Once he defaults with Viridian," Davies continued, "that triggers a cascade. All other lenders will be notified. They will freeze his lines of credit and initiate their own default proceedings. Within 48 hours, his entire financial world will be frozen solid. Then we initiate a full forensic audit under the guise of protecting our investments, an audit which I suspect will uncover a great deal of creative accounting." "He'll be ruined," Clara said, the words tasting strange in her mouth. "He will be held accountable," Arthur corrected her gently. "There is a difference. He built a house of cards on a foundation of deceit and disrespect. We are not blowing it down. We are simply removing one card and letting gravity do the rest. The plan was set. The team dispersed, moving with a quiet, lethal efficiency. Arthur turned to Clara. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice full of concern. "Once this begins, it cannot be stopped." Clara looked at the digital whiteboard, at the complex map of her husband's empire. She saw it not as a collection of corporate entities, but as a monument to his ego, a monument built at her expense. "I'm sure," she said, her voice steady. "Make the call." The first domino fell at 11 a.m. the next day. Richard was in his office, feet up on his desk, barking orders into his phone at a contractor. His secretary buzzed in. "Mr. Vance, you have an urgent email from Pinnacle Bridge Financing." "Pinnacle?" he grunted. "Never heard of them." "Ignore it. It's probably spam." "Sir, the subject line is notice of immediate loan recall and demand for payment." Richard's feet hit the floor. He swiveled to his computer and pulled up the email. He read it once, then twice. A demand for $7 million by tomorrow morning, citing a breach of Section 12, subsection C. It was absurd, a clerical error. He immediately called his primary contact at what he thought was his main bank, Viridian Capital. He expected a swift apology and a promise to sort out the mess. Instead, he was met with a wall of impenetrable corporate politeness. "I'm sorry, Mr. Vance, we have no information on that," a junior associate told him. "Pinnacle is a separate entity." "Don't give me that," Richard roared. "You people are all connected. Get me someone who knows what they're doing." He spent the next hour being transferred from one department to another, a bureaucratic nightmare that left him seething with rage. No one seemed to be able to help him. His charm, his threats, his name-dropping, none of it worked. The system that had always bent to his will had suddenly become rigid and unyielding. Panic began to curdle in his stomach. He called his CFO. "Peterson, some idiot at a company called Pinnacle is calling a $7 million loan. Fix it." "I'll look into it, Richard," Peterson said, his voice already strained. "But we don't have $7 million in liquid cash. We'd have to pull from the Viridian credit line." "Then do it!" Richard snapped and slammed down the phone. He tried to put it out of his mind, to focus on the waterfront deal, but a seed of unease had been planted. By late afternoon, that seed had grown into a thorny vine of pure terror. Peterson called back, his voice a panicked squeak. "Richard, they've frozen the Viridian line. They sent a notice. Because we haven't satisfied the Pinnacle demand, we're in technical default. They're citing a cross-default provision. All our assets with them are frozen, pending review." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. "What? That's impossible." But it was just the beginning. The cascade had started. An email arrived from another lender, then another, all citing the Viridian default, all freezing his accounts. His billion-dollar empire was being strangled, and he couldn't figure out who had their hands around its throat. He was a lion caught in a net woven from invisible thread. He spent the rest of the day and most of the night on the phone, his voice going from a roar to a wheedle to a desperate plea. Every door was shut in his face. The friendly bankers who had once courted him now spoke to him with the cold formality of undertakers. He was being treated like a stranger, a nobody. When he finally stumbled home late that night, he looked like a man who had aged a decade in a day. His suit was rumpled, his face was ashen, and his eyes were wide with a terror he couldn't comprehend. Clara was waiting for him in the living room, reading a book. She looked up as he entered, her expression one of mild, wifely concern. "Richard, is everything all right? You look terrible." He stared at her, his mind racing. He saw her simple dress, her quiet demeanor, and in his desperation he saw a potential lifeline, a pathetic, Flimsy lifeline, but the only one he had left. "It's a disaster, Clara," he rasped, collapsing into a chair. "A conspiracy. Someone is trying to ruin me. They've frozen everything. A temporary cash flow problem." "Oh, you poor thing," she said, her voice dripping with a sympathy so perfect. It was a work of art. She came over and put a hand on his shoulder. His skin was cold and clammy. "Is there anything I can do to help?" He looked up at her, his eyes full of a desperate, calculating hope. "Your uncle?" he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Arthur. He must have a pension, some savings. It wouldn't have to be much, just a small loan, 20, maybe 30,000, just to tide me over, to pay some lawyers until I sort this out." Clara looked down at the man who had, just 2 nights ago, thrown $100 bill at her uncle as a gesture of contemptuous pity. And now he was begging that same man for a loan. The cosmic perfection of it was almost too much to bear. A cold, serene calm settled over her. The final act was about to begin. "I don't think he can help you, Richard," she said, her voice losing its sympathetic warmth and taking on a chillingly neutral tone. "Why not?" he demanded, his desperation making him angry. "Don't be selfish, Clara. This is my life's work on the line. You owe me this, after everything I've given you." Clara slowly removed her hand from his shoulder and took a step back. The pretense was over. "What have you given me, Richard?" she asked, her voice quiet, but carrying the force of a gathering storm. "A big house? Expensive jewelry? Did you give me respect? Did you give me a voice? Or did you just give me a cage and call it a palace?" Richard stared at her, confused by this sudden rebellion. "What are you talking about? I'm talking about my company." "So am I," she said. She walked over to the fireplace mantel and picked up a framed photo of them on their wedding day. They looked so happy, so full of hope. It was a lie. "You spent 10 years treating me like a possession, Richard, an accessory you could trot out at parties. You spent 10 years mocking my family, mocking my intelligence, making me feel worthless." "This is not the time for your little dramas, Clara," he snarled, trying to stand, but the day's stress had left him weak. "Oh, but it is," she said, turning to face him fully. Her eyes were like chips of ice. "It's the perfect time. You humiliated my Uncle Arthur at dinner the other night. You threw money at him like he was a beggar. You called him a nobody." She took a deliberate step closer. "But what you didn't know, what you were too arrogant and self-obsessed to ever even consider, was that your faceless bankers, the consortiums and funds you were so sure, loved you. They all answer to him." Richard's face went slack with disbelief. "You're insane." "Am I?" Clara asked, a cruel little smile touching her lips for the first time. "Pinnacle Bridge Financing, Viridian Capital, Blue Ridge Financial, they're all just branches of the same tree, Richard. And the root of that tree is the Aurelian Global Fund, a $40 billion fund controlled by one man." She let the silence stretch, watching the dawning horror in his eyes as he began to understand.
"Every loan," she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Every dollar you used to build this paper castle, it all came from my uncle, the irrelevant nobody. He owns you, Richard. He has for years. And 2 days ago, I was the one who told him to take it all back." The truth hit him like a physical blow. He staggered back, his face a mask of utter, soul-shattering disbelief. It wasn't possible. The world didn't work that way. The quiet old man in the cheap suit couldn't be the god who controlled his universe. The mousy, compliant wife couldn't be the agent of his apocalypse. "No," he whispered. "No, it's a lie. A trick." But he knew it was the truth. It was the only explanation for the surgical precision of his ruin. It was the only thing that made sense of the unyielding, impenetrable wall he had crashed against.
His disbelief shattered, replaced by a volcanic eruption of rage. "You," he screamed, his voice cracking, "you did this to me! You and that pathetic old man! I will destroy you! I will sue you! I will tell everyone what you did!" Clara watched his breakdown with a detached, clinical calm. The screaming, the threats, they were the pathetic death throes of a tyrant who had just lost his kingdom. He was nothing without his money, just a loud, empty man in a fancy suit. "You have nothing left to sue with, Richard," she said calmly. "By morning, the audit will have begun, and I imagine Mr. Davies will find enough evidence of fraud in your books to interest the district attorney. You won't be destroying anyone. You'll be too busy trying to stay out of prison." She walked to the small table by the door. She slowly, deliberately pulled off her wedding ring, the large, ostentatious diamond he had bought to show off his wealth, and placed it next to a thick envelope. "Those are the divorce papers," she said. "My lawyer will be in touch with yours, assuming you can still afford one." With that, she turned and walked out of the room. She didn't look back. She could hear him behind her, his rage collapsing into ragged, broken sobs. The sound of his world ending was the first note in the symphony of her new life. She walked out the front door, into the cool night air, and didn't stop walking until the grand, imposing house was just a distant silhouette against the dark sky. In the months that followed, Richard's downfall was as complete as it was spectacular. The forensic audit uncovered years of financial misconduct, inflated asset valuations, fraudulent loan applications, and outright embezzlement. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence, he was indicted on multiple counts of fraud. His assets were seized, his company was dismantled, and his name became a toxic byword for arrogance and failure. The society friends who had once clamored for his attention now crossed the street to avoid him. He was sentenced to 10 years in a federal prison, a fate far worse than the simple poverty he had always feared. He had lost not just his money, but his freedom and his very identity. Clara, on the other hand, flourished. Arthur, true to his word, ensured she was not just financially secure, but truly independent. He set up a trust in her name, giving her control over a fortune that dwarfed anything Richard had ever pretended to have. But Clara had learned the true value of money from watching both men. It was not a tool for building monuments to one's ego, but a tool for building a better world. She did not buy a mansion or a sports car. She sold the grand house and all its gaudy contents, donating a portion of the proceeds to charity. She used the bulk of her newfound wealth to establish the Pendleton Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to providing legal aid and financial counseling to women escaping emotionally and financially abusive relationships. She found her purpose not in art history, but in helping others rewrite their own. Her life became quiet, but it was a rich, meaningful quiet, not the empty silence of her marriage. It was filled with the gratitude of the women she helped, the respect of her colleagues, and the simple, rediscovered joy of her own company. One crisp autumn afternoon, about a year after she had walked out of Richard's life forever, she was sitting at a small outdoor cafe reviewing a case file. A man at the next table accidentally knocked over his cup, splashing coffee near her papers. "Oh, I am so sorry," he said, rushing to help blot the spill with a napkin. He was a man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, an architect who was sketching the building across the street in a small notebook. His name was Michael. They started talking about architecture, about art, about the city. The conversation was easy, natural, and full of mutual respect. There was no posturing, no agenda. When he asked if he could see her again, Clara smiled a genuine, unburdened smile. "I'd like that very much," she said. As she walked home that evening, the setting sun casting a warm glow on the city streets, Clara reflected on the long journey she had taken. She finally understood the lesson her uncle had tried to teach her through his quiet example. True power lies not in what we display to the world, but in the strength of our character and the integrity of our actions. Arrogance is a fortress built on sand, destined to be washed away by the tides of truth. True wealth isn't measured in dollars or stock portfolios, but in the quiet dignity with which we live our lives and the compassion we show to others. Richard had spent his life chasing a loud, glittering illusion, while the real treasure had been sitting quietly across the dinner table from him all along. He was just too blind to see it.